All right, welcome back to the Writer's Lens. This is Josh JCL Felto, and today I am joined with another special guest here on the Writer's Lens. He is a pastor at Bellevue Christian Church in Pittsburgh, PA. He's also a student finishing up his Master of Divinity at Trinity School for Ministry. He's been married for 7 years. He's the father of a budding young boy named Levi, a great, very good name. And he's the author of A Restless Age, How St. Augustine Helps You Make Sense of Your Twenties. He is Austin Gohn. How are you, sir?
I'm good, but we have to decide from the beginning if we're going to go with Augustine or Augustine. So we got to make a decision early. There seems to
All
be
right.
there's some contention about which one of those you need to say in certain circles.
Okay.
But
So, well, I'll let you decide then. Do you want to do
I
Augustine or do you want to
I
do
tend to say
Augustine?
I tend to say Augustine, but Augustine comes off the tongue a little easier sometimes. The natural, if you're just seeing it for the first time, you say Augustine,
Yeah.
and then you hear somebody say Augustine, you're like, maybe I should say Augustine. So it doesn't really matter. We'll
I,
figure it
I
out.
will I will do my best throughout this, Austin, to basically go with what you want to do. So we'll go with Augustine as best I
Well,
can.
I was gonna go with whatever you said. I'm just gonna say that the rest of the time, so I didn't shame you or
All right. So
wait.
this will be great. This will be good. So Austin and I got connected via actually a very close connection of mine. My brother, Jonathan Felto, who
Is that what J stands for in JJ?
yeah,
I never
yeah,
know.
yeah. They obviously know each other very well. They know they know.
I don't
there's
even know what the J stands for.
there's a close kinship that I can feel with Austin and my bro. So,
Kindred spirits, as Anne would say. No,
but my brother told me about Austin and said, "Hey, this guy's writing a book, and he seems pretty baller. You might want to talk to him a little bit about his writing process. The book's coming out soon, which we'll get to in this interview." But yeah, that's how I've been connected with this fellow writer and scribe. And this is your first book, right, Austin?
this is book one,
Book one.
and yeah, this is it. I have not written any books before this
So
or attempted any.
so that's good, man. You're like the publishing virgin right now. So this is
That's
great.
it.
This is this is good.
I'm gonna put that
Um,
as my Twitter bio. I think it's from here on out.
yes, absolutely. Do that, and then you can take it down after the first one's out. So
Great, good.
you can do that.
Yeah,
So
shameful.
yeah. So clearly, Austin's a writer, and I've actually been reading a little bit of Restless Age. So I appreciate you giving me kind of an advanced copy. It's not signed yet though, since we've been having to read it through PDF and Google and all that kind of good stuff. But I like it,
That
sir.
will literally decrease the
Yep.
value of the book if I
Right.
sign it.
Well, you can't sign it. You can't sign it. So
Yeah,
you
you're right.
know,
You're right.
I'll have to get the physical copy at some point.
Good.
But I guess I want to quit talking about that and just kind of get into you here and your story and what is it that kind of inspired Mr. Gohn here to write a book. But I mean, what's your story in general? So I mean, we know that you're a pastor, and this book being about Saint Augustine. Uh, rolling with, I told you I'll do my best to roll
Hey,
with
it doesn't
that.
matter. It's interchangeable. It doesn't really matter.
uh,
So we
so
want to, yeah. So we'll try to get to where I am, how I started writing.
mhm.
Is that how that works?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I will give you a short version of my story, but I grew up in a lot of places. Most recently in high school was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where I met JJ.
Mhm.
And I left for college to a small cornfield Bible college in Illinois called Lincoln Christian University. I'm not sure why I went there. I think I was running away from some things,
Mm.
I ended up there because somebody in my life, a youth minister, I think, had mentioned it once, and it seemed good enough. So I applied real late and showed up for the first day of classes and registered then, and went there. And I got an intercultural studies degree. I really had plans to never come back to Pittsburgh. Was kind of like my ticket away was intercultural studies degree.
Huh.
And so I took my intercultural studies degree. I did an internship in Japan with a church planting network called Mustard Seed. I think it's either Mustard Seed Network, but they plant churches in Japan. I interned with them one summer. I met some pastors working at a church plant in a city called Nagoya. And when I was when I was just with them and spending a lot of time, and I had a lot of alone time there as well, just kind of just exploring the city on my own, thinking and
Is
thinking
that
about my
because you
future.
couldn't speak the language, or is it
Yeah,
because?
there was definitely a language barrier that I mean, there's a surprising amount of Japanese people who speak English, but my Japanese was not anything worthwhile. So, but being around those pastors really kind of like gave me a vision for being a pastor. And so I left that internship with full intention to go back to Japan, but through just kind of a set of events that unfolded over the next 6 months, I ended up moving back to my hometown of Bellevue, which is a neighborhood right outside of Pittsburgh, and just really wanted to do something about young adults. That's where it all started for me. Was I saw our church had grown since I'd left, but we were missing a lot of young adults, it felt like. And so I didn't really know what to do about that, but I'd grown up in church. My dad's a pastor, and my dad's the pastor of the church where I work now. And so I moved back and started working part-time there for, I remember I wrote up a little tiny budget of like, here's what I think me and my wife Julie, and what we could live off of if you pay me this much. It was not actually a livable wage, but that was what I asked them to pay me. And so we both got jobs. It wasn't their fault, but so we both got jobs at coffee shops and bookstores. And so we were working part-time jobs and working as a young adults pastor for those next, basically since then, now bringing that me up till now. But about 4 years ago, I started doing, I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to keep doing, and an opportunity to attend a seminary pretty close to me called Trinity School for Ministry. It's an amazing seminary. It's an Anglican seminary. I'm not Anglican, but they just welcomed me, and we share a lot of thinking on things. And so I went there, and they provided some really good scholarships. They have some amazing donors who make the school flourish and make it easy for students to go there. Because, if you get 90 credits in a master's degree, it can load up you with a lot of debt, but they really try to make a way for students. So I started going there. And I had some professors. One of them is Wes Hill. He's also an author. He's written a lot of books in Christian circles. And he started commenting on my writing and my papers. I never seen myself as a writer. I've been primarily a preacher and a speaker up until that point. I've always kept a journal. And here and there, I write when I started my young adults ministry for the first year and a half. I was writing blog posts, like multiple a week for that. And then I'd written like an article or two for the first time before college, but I never saw myself as a writer. That wasn't like in my way of seeing myself until I went to college. And then two particular professors started to comment on my writing, like, hey, you should really write more. You should try writing book reviews, just little things that can help get your writing out there. And so they didn't just comment on the style or on the content. They commented on the style of my papers. And I think when they started to comment on it, I started to see some consistent patterns throughout my life, where I saw other professors had commented on my papers in college and even in high school. And so there's just started to make some connections, like maybe I could write, and maybe I've been seeing myself as a speaker primarily, but maybe I do care a lot about words, and I wonder what it would like to start to write some of them down. And so it was really
writing will help you speak better, right? And will speak well.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of weird where the more writing you do, the more, even as you speak, is influenced by your writing. And then if you're in a season where you're doing a lot of speaking, it feels like your writing reflects more of your speaking. And then I think they do weird things to each other. If you're writing and speaking, they're not the same kinds of things, but they shape each other.
Yep.
And so I try to write like I speak, but even the way that I write now has changed how I speak in some ways. And so I don't know. So right now I feel like I'm more of a writer than a speaker, but I feel like I can switch back any day and feel like for the next couple of years, feel like I'm more of a speaker than a writer. And so I think I go back and forth between those two things. So out of all of that, with my experience with young adults, about 2 years ago, around January 2 years ago, I have a journal that's a 5-year journal, and I just write a few lines a day. And 2 years ago, I think I'm going to try writing a tiny little book for young adults. And maybe I'll just make it a downloadable PDF that young adults, if they come to our church, they can read it. And so I preached a couple of sermons toward them for my young adults ministry, over 5 months, just 5 different sermons. And I was like, I'll just turn each of those sermons maybe into a chapter of a book and see if I could do that. And that's really where it got going. Originally, was trying to do that. Yeah.
That's cool, man. That's quite a unique turn of events as far as your story is concerned, because I think a lot of people go, yeah, I'm going to move far away and I'm not going to come back home. I'm never going to do that. And considering how you went across the Pacific and you were over in Japan, and that's kind of where you got your inspiration to come back and start pastoring, really. I think
Yeah,
that's really interesting. I mean, I went from Pennsylvania to Ohio, and I'm still in Ohio, so I don't know if that's a
pretty much the same thing.
yeah, it's totally
So,
the same thing. There's a different accent here. I think I've gotten the Cleveland accent where I'm at,
yeah.
but yeah, that's really interesting. And as far as the people recognizing your talent as opposed to you thinking you had any, I mean, that was a big deal, obviously, having peers and other people looking over your shoulder and saying, "Hey, Austin, you got some good stuff here as far as your style is concerned, right?"
Yeah, and I think I've had a hard time recognizing ability in myself. So, and I think that's taught me as well too. If I see something in somebody else, whether it's a speaker or a writer, because those are the things I tend to spend most of my time doing, that I try to note it, and because maybe they don't see it themselves, maybe they sense it. Like I think I sense that I was better with words than a lot of other people, and so I think maybe I sensed it, but it took people affirming that for me to really want to have the courage to do anything. And same thing with speaking. I did not. I had a terrible public speaking first experience where it was just plummeted and burned, and just every joke flopped, and it just couldn't have gone worse. And from then on, I was like, okay, well, I think I'm not going to do that anymore. And then I had a good public speaking experience, and then just people would affirm that. And I think that's what gave me courage and made me better, and the courage to pursue those kinds of things.
That's great, man. Now, you've been talking about young adults and whatnot. So, just so that everyone who's listening knows, when you say young adults, like what age group are you specifically talking about?
Yeah, I have a very specific way that I talk about young adulthood, and I use a phrase. It's the phrase age and stage. Young adulthood is difficult to define because some people, when they think of young adulthood, they think primarily of an age, and that's one way of thinking about it. And I think it reflects young adulthood, where it's from your high school graduation party until like your early 30s at the latest, and it tends to fall in that age range. And there's science that backs that up, neuroscience that talks about how your brain is in some major developmental phases in your 20s. And so there's something unique happening in young or emerging adulthood that isn't happening in another period in your life. So there's something biologically happening in that age. At the same time, though, and there's a woman named Meg Jay who wrote a book called The Defining Decade a couple of years ago. She has a short TED Talk. You can get the gist of that book from listening to the TED Talk. And she kind of introduced me to some of that that side of things. And then, but from my experience with young adults, I'm sure somebody's written about this somewhere, but I tend to see it as a stage. And there's other authors who have talked about the stage of emerging adulthood and some of the things about it. But the way I personally understand it is a stage of open-ended searching where you're looking for closure on what I call 5 basic young adult searches, which are the search for answers. You're trying to figure out what do you believe. You're usually, I'll say the 5 things. So search for answers, habits, belonging, love, and work. And so answers, you're working through doubts and your childhood faith or childhood lack thereof. Habits, some of the habits that were innocent in your teens are starting to become hardwired in your 20s, and you're like, I don't know if this is who I want to be. Belonging, you're transitioning into college sometimes, or just transitioning back transitioning back into my home neighborhood and not having the same friendships that were once there, and just trying to figure out who am I and where do I belong. And then search for love. Doesn't mean that you have to get married in your 20s, but you're usually unsettled in your relational status, whether it's wanting to be single, wanting to be married, and then finally work. That's kind of the main thing on most young adults' mind is where can I work and how can I get health care? Those are kind of our main questions as young adults. And so those 5 searches, the more open-ended they feel, the more likely you're kind of still in young adulthood. And the more closure you're starting to feel around those 5 searches, the more likely it is that you're beginning to no longer see yourself as a young adult, and you're beginning to see yourself more as fitting in with a different stage. So that's why you could have somebody who's 30 who still feels very open-ended on those searches, who still feels like a young adult. And you could have somebody who's 24 who feels pretty closed off on all those searches. They're kind of like, okay, I'm established and like my work. I'm married, or I'm like really confident in my singleness, and so they're kind of already leaving young adulthood in a sense. And so age and stage, that's how I tend to think about it.
No, that's really good. And I know that the book itself, as St. Augustine, we're going to stick with St. Augustine here, you say how he helps you make sense of your 20s. So you're basically kind of almost targeting the 20s though too, right?
Yeah,
because how old are you again?
I'm
29?
29, so I'm right
29.
on the edge.
So you are on the cusp, man. You're almost into
Yeah,
the 30s.
there's an author, I think Daniel Pink wrote a book on time recently, and he talks about how when you're turning a decade, you feel a sudden sense of urgency, and there's studies to prove this, and I think that's true for me. It's like, oh no, I'm turning 30. I've got to get stuff done before I turn 30, and then it's all going to slow down again until 39. I'm like, I'm almost 40. Yeah, I think 20s is a way of like kind of just encapsulating young adulthood, and so it tends to fall in that 20 to 29, but it includes 18, it includes 31, but yeah, how to make sense of your 20s.
Do you think it's interesting though, and this might be going down the rabbit hole aside from writing, and we'll get back to it in a second, but I'm just curious, in your experience working with young adults in their 20s, do you feel like that stage lasts longer with this generation? Is it a little bit longer maybe, or is there more searching going on? How is that? What's your experience?
There are factors that I think there are plenty of studies that will show you that I mean, even people will say young adulthood is a new thing. There was adolescence and there was adulthood, and that this whole concept of young adulthood is a new thing. And yes and no, it's kind of new and it's kind of not. But I think one of the reasons that it tends to feel new is that historically, those 5 searches I was talking about, you tend to get closure, especially work and love. Those ones you tend to get closure earlier in your 20s than now. And so, with careers changing rapidly, with people delaying marriage for a variety of different reasons, young adulthood tends to feel longer than ever. So it's a bigger, it's its own stage of development now in the way that it hasn't always been. And that's partly because we're delaying many of the indicators of entering into adulthood. So things like economic stability, no longer dependent on parents, and it's not all their fault. There's a lot of we live in an intriguing economy. A lot of it has to do with the generation before us, but nonetheless, what's happened is young adulthood has slowly started to expand because of those what different sociologists have termed the indicators of growing into adulthood. We're reaching those later.
Yeah.
That's lots of questions. Yeah.
That's a really good summation, I think, Austin. That was a really good, just kind of, I don't want to say it's the primer is the right word, but just kind of bringing it all together in a synthesis there about how, younger people in their 20s, I think it tends to look that direction, that people kind of think, well, they're 28, 29, but they're still young, right? They're still kind of figuring things out. Like there's more of that perception, I think, now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also what's interesting about your book is that you're really targeting young adulthood in your 20s, because there's a majority of people that right now are doing that. They're going through that transitionary period in their 20s. So so that's really good. Do you think as far as the book being called A Restless Age, is that something that could apply even to the generation as a whole, or is it just primarily for people going through kind of young adulthood? I mean, it might be a bit of an existential question, but I think it's a pretty good one.
Well, I'll start with this, is that I've had a lot of, I have about 100 people, and I have an amazing launch team of people who are helping read the book early and getting the book into other people's hands. We can talk more about that a little later, but some of them are older who are on the launch team, who are in their 40s or 50s or 60s even, and even 70s. And they've read some of the people who have read that, like one of my friends read it, and she just talked to me about it. And she's not in her 20s anymore, but she said, man, there is plenty in this book that made sense to me now in this point in my life. And I think that's because our 20s, let me explain what I mean by the word restless. I take that from Augustine, where there's a famous quote, a lot of people have heard him, Christian or non-Christian, this quote of, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Yeah. And it's in the opening page of Augustine's Confessions. And it's his way of saying that our souls, ourselves, look for fulfillment or peace or stability in lots of different things. And my way of saying that is we look for peace and stability in, like, if I could just get those 5 searches, if I could just find work, if I could just get love, if I could just find belonging, I'd feel at rest. But Augustine says, look, none of those things are going to do it for you. You have to come to God, order your life around him. And only from that place are you then in a place to search for love and work and all those things, not as the ultimate meaning in your life, but as things that flow from having already found everything you need in God. Now, that said, you're gonna feel that very amplified in your 20s. That there's a sense in which you feel that restlessness Augustine talks about, where you're searching for things to give you stability and peace and fulfillment in a pretty magnified way in your 20s. But you're going to experience that in other ways throughout your whole life. It doesn't mean you don't experience it in your teens, and it doesn't mean you won't experience it in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And so I think any age could really be a restless age, but I think your 20s are a particularly magnified version of restlessness. And it's also the only decade that I feel qualified to write to. So
considering, well, you haven't quite got to the 30s yet. So
yeah. And the fact that, and Augustine's Confessions, most of it takes place. So it's him writing about his spiritual journey from the inside, trying to explain it. And most of it takes place between his mid to late teens and before his 32nd birthday, which is around when he was converted. And so most of it takes place in his 20s, which is just really works for the audience that I'm working for.
That's really good. How much time went into researching Augustine, reading the book, obviously Confessions, but also just maybe researching him and kind of getting a little bit into his head to kind of have an idea, how you were going to pen the book and whatnot. I mean, what was that process like for you as far as putting this book together?
Well, I'll admit I put some major constraints on myself. So Augustine has written, this perspective is going to be nothing, but he's written more than this many books. So he's written lots of pages on things,
Right.
There's shelves worth of Augustine. If you go to a theological library in your local city, you will find works upon works upon works by Augustine. And I don't have time for that. So when it came to Augustine, I've read other things by him, but for this book, I just read Augustine's Confessions multiple times through, and just read it very patiently. I've reread sections, made sure I really understood that. I read a commentary that went along with it by a guy named Peter Kreeft called, I can't think of what it's called, but Peter Kreeft wrote a commentary on the book, and I used that. And I discovered it really late, unfortunately, but it helped me right at the end just to make sure I was going in the right direction. And then I read one biography. So my primary source, if you want to think about primary and secondary, my primary source was Augustine's Confessions. And there were other people that were like, you should really read this sermon by Augustine. You should read this. And I'm like, can't. I'm just putting constraints on. I'm only going to read Augustine's Confessions. And then I read one kind of proven biography on him by a guy named Peter Brown called Augustine of Hippo. And he's written kind of the definitive biography. There's been some recent ones in recent years, but that's kind of a classic work on him. And so I kind of stuck with Augustine's Confessions and Peter Brown's biography and try to read those as closely as I could. And I think for me, I can over-research and I can research to no end. There's a guy...
I get that vibe from you, Austin. I have the same problem.
Yeah, there's a book called The War of Art. Yeah, it's by a guy named, I think it's by Stephen Pressfield. I'm going to go with that.
Yep.
And in the book, he talks about how there's a tendency to think that research is work. And so you can just keep researching, but you got to stop at some point and just start the thing. And for me, I might put the constraints on it. So I'm going to read Augustine's Confessions. I'm going to read Peter Brown's biography. And then I'm going to write based on all the other research I've done about young adulthood. And I read articles here and there on different topics in the book just to kind of find some fresh information on stuff. But I have a pretty good log in Evernote of everything I've ever read. And so that I find worthwhile. I keep really good notes, and I started there, and then I would go track down the quote in a book if I had to, if it wasn't exact. And so, that's kind of for me. I put major constraints, and that's kind of for me, I let my creativity flow from those constraints.
That's great, man. That's actually a pretty wise decision considering this is the first book you're writing, because I just think people who are writing something maybe first go around, the tendency is to think that I have to research as much as I can because I have all this information available to me. I should get as much on my fingertips as possible in order to write the best thing that I can do. And really by constraining yourself, like you're saying, you can kind of zero in a little bit better because as much as we have, we're letting things come in, we still have filters, right? We still have ways that we're seeing things and we're reading things and we're interpreting things. And we really don't know what exactly we're going to be filtering out either when we actually sit down and write it, So putting a stoppage on the amount of time we spend researching something and then actually putting it on paper, that does affect the way that our voice is generated. essentially.
Yeah.
When you're writing anything.
Yeah, and I do think you can over research. You can research something to death, and
Yeah.
and eventually, a lot of people are saying you're always going to find another angle, another thing. You just gotta just decide. It's the same thing with preaching. I'm just speaking every other Sunday, and you can read and read and read and read and read, but eventually you just got to decide we're going to go in this direction and put some constraints and say, or I'm only going to read this commentary. I'm only going to read this one thing. I'm going to go with it. I don't have time to read 7 of these.
Now
And
sorry. Finish your thought. Go ahead.
that's it. No, that was the end of my thought.
Okay.
Period.
Yeah, because I actually was going to say, because I haven't read through all of A Restless Age, so I didn't want to give away spoilers or anything. But is that something also, I'm just curious, in the age of Google, being a 20-something and having everything at your fingertips and whatnot, is that a unique challenge too that you think, 20-somethings deal with, as far as I have to research everything about how to find the right job, and I have to, in order to get my love life correct, and how I'm going to feel I'm going to belong somewhere or something like that. I mean, is that also a challenge, you think?
I would point you to, there's a great, not TED Talk, it's a Q Talk by a guy named Andy Crouch. And he's written a couple different books on culture and things like that. But he has his most recent Q Talk, I can't remember what it's called. He talks about how for a long time, wisdom was something handed down from generation to generation. So, for example, me and my wife are raising a child right now, and back in the day, you didn't have a book. You just had to go to your parents. You had to go, and the people your parents knew, and you had to ask them, what do I do when I'm encountering this problem? Now, you can ask your friends on Facebook, and this happens all the time, where you'll say, hey, my son has a temperature that's 95, or what's the normal like 97 or something, and he's sneezing every time he goes outside. Like, what should I do? And you get like 1,000 answers. And if you start typing that into Google, you get tons of different streams of thought. And so it can become very overwhelming. And so I think in general for me, my tendency tends to be find something that's good enough, find one person or two people you can trust on a subject, and just make them your kind of go-to person to ask, rather than asking Google and the whole internet or tons of people. And so we live in a weird time where, again, Andy Crouch talks about how wisdom was passed down, and all the inherited wisdom from forever was inside of your mom or your dad on parenting. And so you went to them, but now you read 20 books and things like that. And so, yeah, we do live in a different time. And so you got to kind of limit your sources, and you got to decide, what, we're going to good enough.
That's great. That's a deep dive into like psychology that I would love to get into, man. But we're going to stay focused on your book.
That's about as deep as I can go.
That's about as deep as you can.
I point to Andy Crouch, and I don't have any advice for parents. I don't know. We don't know what we're doing. Well, that's the thing. When you start to read all this stuff out there, you're like, how did anybody keep a baby alive ever for the entire history of the world without knowing everything we know? Well, you start to realize you'll be okay. Just ask them.
Well, it was also like, power by numbers back then too. I mean, people were having kids as often as they could. It's not. I mean,
you had to increase your chances.
Yeah, I mean, most families it was like, we got 12 mouths to feed, but we need all 12 because not all 12 of us might survive the winter. So
yeah,
I mean, it's just.
This got depressing in a hurry.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So,
I wasn't aware. Man, it's quite the podcast.
Yeah. That we talk about some depressing stuff on the Writer's Lens. I didn't know if I should tell you that before you got on the show, or just right when we started talking about it. So I'm glad we hit that up, Austin. So that was good. So anyway, so getting back again to just your writing process and everything else. I mean, I think this is really helpful for people who are writing or just starting off or whatever project they're trying to undertake. What does the typical day look like? I mean, what did it look like for you in terms of the process of, I started this thing, I'm outlining it, or maybe I don't outline it, I just go straight into it. What does that look like, and how much time would you give yourself per day, would you say, to kind of do that?
I'll try to make sure I kind of stay on subject. I'll just go from when I wrote a real ugly manuscript. Okay. And I submitted it to GCD Books, Gospel Centered Discipleship Books, and to the person who's in charge at the time, still is, Jeremy Wrightball. And I heard back a couple months later, which is there's usually a delay in these things. And so I submitted it in like July. I heard back in like November,
Ooh.
So year and a half ago, and they were like, "Yeah, we'd love to do this. This looks awesome." And at that point, actually, it had nothing to do with Augustine's Confessions. The book was very different, and I hadn't even. It was in between November and January when I restarted writing my manuscript that I read Augustine's Confessions again, and I said, this is the book. This is what I needed. This is the structuring piece of the whole book. And that's a whole different thing. But so January is when I started rewriting the manuscript. And I did a couple of things. Is I knew the structure of the book. There's an introduction. There's the 5 searches, 5 chapters. There's a conclusion. And then I knew there's at least 1 to 2 appendices that I might add on to the end. And so the way that I work is I work basically between Evernote and Google Drive. And I would note this as well. And I learned this as a photographer. My wife and I have both been photographers, is that often you think you need to have all the right equipment before you can do something well. And I now know that there are lots of writing tools out there to help people write, Scrivener and a bunch of other things. But
Grammarly is another one.
I wrote this whole book using Evernote and Google Drive. So Google Docs and Evernote, that was it. And so Evernote is how I kept track of my research. I formed a folder for each of the chapters of the book, and I just dropped in any relevant piece of research into that. And then when I got close to preparing to write that chapter, I started to kind of pull it together, see if I could kind of think through what's the angle here, what's the outline of the chapter. And so I did that all in Evernote, just kind of keeping information. So if I read an article on love and I knew I have a love chapter, I'm just going to put that over there for now and summarize the article and what I gained from it, and I'll get back to it in a couple months when I start writing about it. So that way it's always kind of happening in the back of my mind. And if I ever have a thought, or I'm having a conversation with a young adult and I say something about love and I'm like, oh, and I make a note. So that's the other thing. I always carry around this is a notebook by a company called Bull and Stash. I don't know if you can see that. And it's got paper that you can pull out in the middle. I don't want to show you because I don't know. There's something important on there. But that whenever I have a thought, I write it down there, and then I usually transfer it to Evernote later. And so I'm always, you're always researching, even if you're not thinking or intentionally doing it. And so, but you got to always have a way to collect that information and just put it somewhere until you need it. And so that's what I would do with my notebook and with Evernote. And so by the time I actually started writing the chapter, I had a ton of research done. And maybe there was one thing I needed to research more. So when it actually came to writing then, it worked out that I basically wrote a chapter a month for 5 months. From my due date was May, I don't know, I think it was like May 28th or something. And then I started rewriting the manuscript on January 2nd. And so I spent each month trying to write a chapter. And then along with that, I was trying to also write the introduction, the conclusion, and the appendices, which is kind of in other time when I wanted to get away from the chapter and work on something else. So, and then I pulled it all together kind of at the end. And my basic writing schedule was on Monday, and everybody's got their own thing. So the way I learned to do a writing schedule, I read a book by, there's a guy named Austin Kleon who wrote.
Oh yeah, Austin Kleon.
Yeah, he's the man. He has a new one coming out, I think, but he wrote a book called Still Like an Artist and one called Show Your Work. I've read both of those. They're both great. He just has some really good, pithy, helpful things. And one of the things that, anyways, I think on Twitter or something, he suggested a book called The Clockwork Muse. And I think it's really written more for people writing a dissertation or something like that. But it's basically, how can you get on a schedule to make sure you're producing and so that you can actually get the thing done on time. Deadlines are very important to me. I feel them like they're commitments. And so I know that writers miss deadlines all the time, but it was very important for me to hit the deadline. And even though I think it was like a made up deadline, I don't think it was a real deadline. I think we just put a number out there, but I felt committed to it so we worked toward May 28th. And anyway, so my week then was structured. The way my creative juices flow is I tried to do, I have other jobs. I'm a pastor, and that's my normal job. I'm also a student, and then I'm a husband and a father. So, and I actually, when I was writing the book, my son was only 3 months old. So in that January when I started writing, so it was not, I would not choose that time again to write a book, but that's
I got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, man. It's tough.
mine's like almost 18 months now. And so I would write on Monday mornings for basically I'd give myself from like 8 to noon,
Mm.
because I also work on Sundays as part of being a pastor. So I just kind of gave myself Monday mornings from 8 to 12 just to work on the book. And that would give me a good start in the week. And
Hmm.
then I would spend usually 2, sometimes 3 other mornings a week between 5:30 and 7:30 a.m. trying to write. And what I found is that I can't wake up and immediately start writing. I need to take 30 to 45 minutes just to drink coffee, for me to pray or read something else,
Hmm.
just to get my juices rolling. Because there was a while there I was like, all right, wake up and just type words. And they were garbage words. They weren't good words. And so I needed time. And so that's basically how I got the book done. It's just a couple hours on Monday to set me up for the week. And then early mornings and our lunch break, sometimes just trying to get a couple words written there. And then the other really good thing that I did, I read a book called Finish by a guy named John Acuff.
I was just going to mention
And
him, man. Yeah.
yeah, and he
Yeah.
talks about how to get goals done. And one thing that he talks about is having some kind of visible marker of progress. And so
Hmm.
I want to say that I think for each chapter I was shooting for between like I want to say like I feel like 6,000 words. I can't remember exactly how long my chapters were,
Hmm.
but I put for every chapter, so beginning of the month, I put a bunch of Post-its on my wall. So if I'm sitting at my computer right now, a bunch of Post-its up behind it,
Hmm.
each representing 500 words. And then at the end, there was some kind of reward, which I don't know, like Chinese takeout. I don't remember what the reward was, but for every 500 words, I took a Post-it off the wall. So there were some mornings where I had written 450 words, and I was like, boy, do I want to take a Post-it off the wall. And so I'd write a couple more sentences to try to get to that marker. And that's honestly how I wrote the book. I just kept pulling Post-its off the wall.
Huh.
So I think if you go deep enough back into my Twitter, you'll see a picture of that
Huh.
somewhere.
That's really
That really
cool.
helps me. I'm very visual, and I like to see progress. And so it's hard to see progress on a book that's, I don't know how many words it is, 35,000 or something like
Hmm.
that. But it's hard to see progress when you're in the middle of chapter one.
Oh yeah, no, that's really good. That's the one that's the give yourself the gift of done. Is that how that book? I think that's what that book was.
Yeah,
Yeah, give yourself. Yeah, Acuff's really solid.
yeah.
Uh,
He's also really pithy. Lots of really good stuff.
yeah, yeah, and he's pretty. Yeah, he's definitely very what's witty, I guess is the best way to put it. I see it. I follow him on Twitter and everything, and he's always
Yeah,
got some pretty good, some pretty good.
I think he like recently did a comedy tour, so he's
Did he?
been
I could
yeah,
see that. I could
he's
totally
been
see
trying some
that
stuff.
out of that guy. Well, that's good. I mean, I definitely wanted you to mention that because, I think to anyone who's an amateur writer, they think that, hey, I got this idea. I'm going to do this over the weekend, or I'm
Yeah.
going, or I'm going to do it maybe in the next couple weeks or
Mhm.
maybe the next month or whatever it is. And then it's almost like you start going on the rabbit hole and wait a second, this might take me a lot longer and I'm going to have to sit longer and do it. I mean, you were saying 8 to 12, usually some time that
Mhm.
you would give yourself on like a Monday,
Yeah.
about 4 hours or so. Yeah, I mean that's important. That's important to eliminate the distractions.
Hmm.
Getting
Yeah, and
up.
I think I mean, I'm sure you know, but
Hmm.
this is not knowledge. But it takes a minute to get rolling, but once you get rolling, you can stay there for a while.
Yeah.
And so like, man, okay, this is coming together. Like I've got words, they're coming out and they're not that bad, but
Yeah.
it takes a while to get there. You're like, typing a sentence and then erasing it and then typing it. It's like 45 minutes of that. And then all of a sudden you're like, boom, going.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Now you go. So now the book's done, and then editing, which is probably my least favorite thing in the entire world. How have you gone about just editing the book? I mean, having a team of people, did you outsource that? Did you do it yourself? Like what does that actually look like?
Yeah, the great thing, I recently tweeted that your team is everything when it comes to this kind of stuff. That I
Hmm.
think that's the biggest lesson I've learned in the whole writing process is that having a team is huge versus doing something by yourself. And I don't think I realized, when you see a book, you're like, wow, and you see the author's name on the front, like,
Hmm.
wow, they wrote this book. But the book is really, I think maybe in a lot of cases, the acknowledgments. And I really try to name people by name in my acknowledgments that really push the book along, a
Hmm.
paragraph or a sentence. It just helped me get to
Hmm.
where I am. And so with editors, the way GCD Books works is they had kind of an editor assigned to me.
Hmm.
His name's Grayson Pope. Amazing guy. He's got his own writing. He's got his own website, and I encourage you to check him out. He's a great writer himself, and but he walked me through the whole process. I didn't know what to do with submitting it to him. But actually, let me go back a step. So even before I So when I was writing that manuscript for those 5 months, every month when I finished a chapter, I had the two best writers I know personally who had time to read that are kind of peers of mine.
Mm-hmm.
One's a woman, one's a man, and had them read. And one read just mostly for like just my wording and sentences in general, and the other person read more for like the structure of my paragraphs and those kinds of things. They both brought different angles
Mm-hmm.
to it. And so they would read it closely each
Mm-hmm.
month after I read a chapter. I'd send it to them first, and they would send it back to me, and I'd make some edits. So even before I sent it off to the official editor,
Mm-hmm.
it had already had two sets of really good eyes on it that then sent off to Grayson. And so then Grayson read through the whole thing, sent back to like, the good thing about what happened with me is I know some people, they get it back from the editor and they're like, you got to change the whole structure of a book. And he was
Yeah.
like, this is great. You don't need to change the structure. The main things was you need to add something here. This paragraph's weak. Your conclusion stinks. And then my actual conclusion to the book was too short. And so he told me that, the actual conclusion of the book was originally like a quarter of what it is now. And it was very different. And I'm glad that he mentioned that. It made the book a lot better. It made it more conclusive, really. And so anyways, he gave that back to me. I made those initial rounds of edits. And then there's two other sort of copy editors who read through it themselves just to get more eyes on it. Like, what are we missing? Paying attention. And they all caught different things. And so then it came back to me. I approved all those edits. And then we started to move toward the final versions of the book. And we got what we called our clean, not final version, which is when we started to send it out for people to endorse. And even then, though, I read through the whole thing again at that point, found more errors that we still had missed. And and then even up till like last week that we were still catching errors. And even one of my early readers is a great editor herself. And she read through the whole thing and sent me a list of other errors that she caught. So, but we were able to incorporate those and make some final changes. So you're just catching errors forever. You're always there.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean,
I'm done.
And it's even on a book of like 35,000 words, right? You said the book's about
that seems right. You could get there and it's like, who knows? I could be way off, but that seems about right.
Yeah. And I just think, some people write books that are like 230, 250,000 words, and you got to think what kind of a team they have to have around them just to help with anything that's going on like that. So that's also good. I mean, as far as having a team, having like the beta readers, I think that's kind of technically the term, that you would use is, people that are getting their hands on it before it actually goes to print or it goes off to the editor themselves. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean,
and there's a woman named Tish Harrison Warren. She wrote a book called Liturgy of the Ordinary. She's from our city. She spoke at a conference where my wife and I happened to be at. It's called Jubilee this past year. And we were recruiting for the organization my wife works for, and the organization that gives us healthcare. And so happy to go help recruit. I love the organization. And anyways, Tish was doing a workshop on writing and her process of writing. So I just kind of snuck in and sat in there, and she talked about writing in community. And that really hit me. And so even before I had the professional editors on it, that the publisher themselves had and were paying to work on my book, I had friends who were reading early manuscripts who were critical and who didn't care about my self-esteem. So who knew that what stunk and needed to tell me, and so we could fix it and make it better. And so they were more committed to a great book than to my feelings.
Which is exactly what you need. I mean, you don't want. I mean, not that it's not bad getting the pats on the back from mom or aunt or dad or whomever. Although convincing my dad to read my own books is a bit of a stretch, but I know I know at least my mom would probably read it. But I
mean, you kind of feel like at times, like, I don't know, like the early years of American Idol when people would go on and like, my mom thinks I'm awesome. Like that's how you kind of feel as a writer at first. You just feel like, are just my friends, and are they just telling me I'm good, but I'm not actually writing anything that anybody should read? And it's just hard to know until you send it out to people to endorse that you don't know and have no investment in it. You're like, yeah, it seems pretty good. I like this.
Well, I think it's a unique dynamic when you have really close friends who maybe have known you a long time and you suddenly present this to them, and they think, oh, do I really think Austin has like, the ability to do this? Or perhaps, I mean, in my case, I've been pretty fortunate to meet some people along my journey as a writer that didn't know me prior, like when I was writing just total garbage back in like college or right out of college. And so they're kind of seeing this stuff for the first time and going, oh, this is really good. Despite all the kind of the mishaps and things that I had years ago, that I just look back and go, ugh, it's very cringeworthy in some way. So,
I mean, that's how I feel. Writing is newer to me, but that's how I feel about speaking. And like when I look at early sermons, even I know when I look at my sermons now, I feel that way 10 years. But like when I look at sermons from 6 years ago, you're like, like I can't believe I can't believe that thing was up there, and I put that kind of stuff out there.
Right.
So
right.
Well, at the time you don't realize it.
Yeah, and you're still learning. I mean, you're going to develop a style speaking as well as much as you develop a style in writing. And we were kind of talking about that, how the two kind of mesh, intertwine, they interweave with one another, and they kind of affect one another. So that'll be an ongoing process for you. So speaking of which, an ongoing process, beyond this book, I know this book is just coming out soon, but as far as beyond it, I mean, like, what are your plans, and like, what are you thinking to do beyond A Restless Age?
I don't know yet. There are pastors. I won't put it that way. That's just going to sound pharisaical. There are those.
I knew where you were going, but it's okay.
I mean, there are those who feel the need to put a book out all the time and to turn every sermon series into a book. Try to stop me from doing that, Josh, if you see me doing that, because I think I could be like, oh, I should turn this into a book. But not everything you preach or teach needs to be a book. There's good chances there's already something better out there, or something that somebody's written on a very similar subject. And there's just a lot of books on the same subject coming out right now. And I think I know that there are things that I've been thinking about and I'm mulling over, but we'll see when I actually start writing those down again. I think I want to start shifting into more articles and essays for a little while, and then begin to kind of experiment with some ideas in essay form, and then see which of those ideas might make sense in a longer thing like a book. So I have a feeling I'll write another book. I like it. I like the process. It's fun. I just enjoy writing, but that's where I'm at right now. So I'm waiting. So there are things that intrigue me.
What's that?
There are things that intrigue me, but I'm waiting to kind of, I'm working them in the background. I'm paying attention and saving a lot of articles in Evernote and thoughts there,
Dude, you and me are like kindred spirits. I use Evernote and Google Drive back and forth all the time. So
you can do a lot with those two things.
Oh, you absolutely can. And it just, so we can go down that another road, or another time, I mean. But as far as, we kind of mentioned the launch team that you have and kind of writing in community. And this might be the last point of it as far as the book is concerned. But in the age of social media and garnering attention for one's book, and, having a publisher behind you is one thing. But as far as having like a social media presence, I mean, how important is that for, say, a new writer? I guess for any writer, really, but for anyone who's trying to build a platform, I mean.
I'd say I don't know, because my platform is not huge. I have like 200 Instagram followers, and I have like somewhere between 500 and 600 Twitter followers. And a bunch of those are like middle-aged moms, because one time Beth Moore liked an essay that I had written, and then she started following me, which, by the way, completely like freaks you out. If like a famous person follows you on Twitter, you're constantly afraid of saying something stupid all of a sudden. Right. But after she liked some of my tweets, like a bunch of middle-aged women started following me, which is fine. I'm glad they're intrigued by what I'm saying. But my platform doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I'm sure, I mean, there are plenty of people who could tell you about like why it's important and what it does. And there's some people who are dedicated completely to building up their social media platforms. And the difficulty is, I know a lot of publishers, even GCD, they asked, what are your followers? What are your current platforms? And, I didn't have a ton. And it's hard. It's like, how do you build a platform until you've got a thing to say? And then, and if you don't get a chance to say the thing you want to say, how are you ever going to gain an audience? And so it's kind of like a circle of stuff, and it's easy to lose your soul, I think, in all of it.
It kind of is. I mean,
so that's what I always talk to. When everybody's like, how's the book coming? I'm like, just try not to lose my soul.
That's a great way of putting it, Austin. Just don't lose your soul in the midst of it, man. Just
my friend Dave Ripper said it to me, and he wrote a book on called The Fellowship of the Suffering, and he just talked to me. He's like, just don't lose your soul in the process, and it can be easy easy to obsess over building a platform. And
Hmm.
I like to be liked. I like when people like me. I know that about myself. And so I have to be careful
Mm.
with that. And it's not a problem if people like me or like something that I say, but I know that I can eat it up. I can obsess
Hmm.
over it, which means if somebody doesn't like me, I can pretend like I don't care, but I do.
Yeah.
Um, and so the original question was about social media. I don't know. I can't give a good answer to that. But what I would say, I'll say about the launch team
Hmm.
is I do know that the only way that a lot of people will hear about your book is through somebody in their network that shares about it. A
Hmm.
lot of times today, there's some incredible independent bookstores around that you can visit and go learn about books that way. And there's a great independent bookstore that I visit locally that I learn about books just by walking in.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the way you're going to learn about books is either by an Amazon algorithm
Hmm. Yeah.
deciding that you should be interested in this book, or by a friend or probably multiple friends suggesting a book to you either in person or on a social media. And so I tried to build a launch team of about 100 people from as many different networks as I could. So like, who are some friends I know living on the West Coast?
Mm.
Who are some friends I know that are Anglicans? Who are some friends I know that are Baptists? Who are some friends? And so different kind of networks and circles, and just ask them, hey, could you join my launch team? And really what that meant was, I'll send you a PDF of my book. It's not the final version. There will still be some errors. And I'll send you basically a weekly email for the 5 to 6 weeks leading up to the launch.
Hmm.
And then at the launch, if you can leave a review on Amazon, and then the week before, which is the week we're in right now when we're recording this,
Mm.
leaving reviews on Goodreads. I don't care. They could be 2-star reviews. Just leave something. Let the world know. Like,
Yeah.
please don't. If it's a 2-star review,
Yeah.
just please
Pl-
give me the grace.
yeah.
But, be honest and let people know what you think. But those kinds of reviews help it get noticed. But then on launch day, which is March 19th for me, sharing about it on social media. And I'm just really encouraging people to do it creatively. So I have a lot of friends who are writing reviews for their college magazines.
Hmm.
I have friends who invited me to speak at their church or at their college ministry or their campus, whatever they do.
Hmm.
And then even, JJ contacting you, he's on my launch team. And so he read it and he said, oh, you should talk to my brother. And so he's gotten it out in his own creative way. He's
Yeah.
leveraged his network. And so it's just an amazing to see when people take ownership even of my book. And so this has become a team's project, and I could not get it in front of the eyes of people that they can. And
Right.
so they have credibility with people that I will never have credibility. People will see my name and it means nothing, but JJ will suggest it to somebody, and now it suddenly has credibility. Yep. And so that's kind of what I want people to do. And ideally, only if it's a good book. If it's a bad book, don't tell people about it. I don't want you to lose your credibility. Mm-hmm. But if it's a good book, by all means, tell people who you think you need to read it.
That's really good. And I think to anyone who's listening or watching this, and you might think to yourself, oh man, Austin's got this kick butt launch team and he's got this, massive network. We talked about, just working in a community and being in a creative community. Really just start there. I mean, if you're someone who's just kind of sitting there going, I don't really know too many people like in my immediate circle that might be able to build into this thing. Don't let that be too daunting, would be my advice, because I think just like Austin, you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere and then start seeing like, well, what are my resources? Figuring out who are the people that I can talk to, that I can connect with, who would trust me, who consider me credible. And you just kind of build it from there. And there's like Malcolm Gladwell has a book called Tipping Point, which I don't know if you're familiar with or not.
I think I haven't read it. So I think I've heard about the concept, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically that, everyone's, in terms of an idea or a business plan, there's like the one person who's like the linchpin to you reaching a massive amount of people. So like if you like, again, Beth Moore, there you go. A great example.
Yeah.
She liked something of yours and all of a sudden there were people that knew about you that had never known you before. Mm-hmm. So there's always that I don't want to say it's a chance, because I don't like using that word too much, but there's the mathematics are with you as far as reaching out to many people and trying to increase your network and just kind of putting yourself out there really to to see who can would be willing to support you in this and getting in community. So that's all really good.
Yeah, start with who you know. My wife and I, we on a road trip, we drive to Illinois to see her family a couple times a year, and we just started listing out people we knew from different networks. And we said, who do we know that we could ask to consider? It's not an easy ask to ask people to read a book, and
what is
Yeah,
it? I
and I
mean,
think
oh, this is nice, you know.
yeah, especially when it's a PDF. So honestly, I know there are people in my life team that really wanted to get to the book but didn't, and they'll probably read it when it comes out in print, and that's fine. I
Yeah,
get it.
yeah, that's totally good, man. I had one final question for you because I don't want to take up
Yeah.
too much of your time because I know you and I are both dads, and we have little ones that are sleeping and everything, and so you might be tired. This is late at night, so so
Yeah.
so we had kind of we're getting back to Augustine himself, and this was actually something you had kind of brought up when we were talking offline about how Augustine was really shaped by a lot of the people around him, the testimonies that were around him and their stories and how they kind of reached him, in a very inward way, him kind of absorbing these.
Yeah.
Because we all kind of look at individual stories and testimonies, and these we really do absorb these. I mean, just as a fellow, brother in Christ, I mean, that's a huge thing, hearing someone's testimony, and just seeing how their life has changed. How do you, kind of view that power in storytelling? I mean, even though you've written something that's nonfiction, technically, you're still
Yeah.
kind of telling a story in a
Yeah.
restless age. I mean, you're really kind of you're bringing it through in the lens of, well, I'm still telling a story to my reader, right? I mean, so
Yeah. I'd start with a quote. I actually have it in the intro to the book by C.S. Lewis, and it's from an essay that I think is called "Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What Needs Said," or something like that. And the quote basically says, there's a famous phrase from it. He says, "Stories have a way," in the way the phrase he says, have a way of stealing past watchful dragons. And what he's trying to say is that you can try to argue with somebody about something, but we have these watchful dragons in our minds that are like, no, I'm not going to be fooled by this. I'm not going to be fooled. I'm not going to be fooled. But a story has a way of entering our brains through like a unlocked back door. It like finds a way around the dragons and enters into us and grabs our imaginations. And before we even realize that something snuck in and has already made its way into us before we even realize it. And so, which is intriguing because when you look at Augustine's story, so Augustine's is a kind of a classic, grew up with a conservative religious mother, walked away from the faith, and spent his 20s searching. And there were two major instances, at least two, there might be more. There were at least two major instances in his life where somebody told him a story and it captured his imagination. One was a time where a man named Simplicianus told him, it might be Simplicanus, I don't really know how to say his name, told him the story of another guy named Victorinus, who was an unbeliever, but who became a Christian. And when Augustine finished hearing this story of this man's conversion, he ends saying, "I was on fire for emulation. I wanted his story to be my story."
oh, wow.
And so, he went to this guy, we'll call him Simplicanus, I don't know his name, how to say his name, said, he probably went to him looking for answers, but what he got instead was a story, and it worked its way into him. And then at another point where he was struggling to make sense of the possibility of a life of singleness, which is something he was considering at the time, somebody else named Pontitianus told him a story about another guy, or told him a story about St. Anthony. And when he told him this story, it said that it put him in front of his own face and he had to think about his life and it really set him on fire. And so it is stories in Augustine's life that really changed his story. And what's intriguing now is that Augustine wrote his own story at the 4th century, and that story has stuck around now for 1,500 years and it has shaped. And the reason is because anytime anybody encounters that story, it continues to resonate. And so stories shaped Augustine, and Augustine's stories continue to shape many people's stories today, which is really what I try to do with The Restless Age, is I try to introduce people to Augustine's story. And my hope is that they might have the same experience with his story that he had with the stories that he heard from other people.
That's really good. That's good stuff. Real deep, real rich. I like that, Austin.
Hey, try my best.
Try my best.
He's the one.
Well, good stuff, man. Hey, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Just kind of deep diving with you a little bit and getting to know you, and just kind of hearing this launch that's coming up for Restless Age. I think you've definitely have, even though this is your first book, you've kind of checked off, I think, all the things that one should be doing if they're going to be doing a launch. So I just want to congratulate you on that, on the book, as well as just really being diligent, man. Through this first publication that you got coming up.
Thanks
So
a lot, Josh. That means a lot.
yeah, man, absolutely. So on that note, where can we find you? I mean, we kind of talked about Twitter, but
Mhm.
where is everyone going to be able to find this book and
Yeah.
find you ultimately? Actually,
Best place to order the book is from an independent bookstore.
mm-hmm.
Call your independent bookstore and let them know about the book. And if they
Mm-hmm.
don't have it, they'll probably order it for you.
Mm.
But there's one independent bookstore that I love that he will send books anywhere. His name is Byron Borger, and he
Mm.
has a bookstore called Hearts and Minds. And I know for a fact he just pre-ordered a bunch of my books, bulk ordered, and he'll be able to give them at a discount
Mm.
to people. And so I encourage you to search Hearts and Minds. And I tend to order a lot of my books from him. And sometimes you pay a little bit more, but you get to have a real relationship with the bookstore owner.
Mm.
And so that's where I would start. And it's with Hearts and Minds, but also it'll be available through Amazon and classic channels like that.
Nice, very good stuff. Well, best of luck to you, sir, on your launch day. I'm sure it'll be awesome. Quit looking for
Yeah.
errors. Don't look for any more.
Yeah. I'm
Just
not looking at it. I don't think I'll read it again. So
no, unless there's a great fan who wants you to you read a
yeah,
chapter or something at a campus or
yeah,
something, right?
yeah. We'll see.
We'll
We'll
see.
see.
So thanks again, Austin. Really appreciate it,
Hey,
man.
thanks a lot, Josh.